Hello, everyone. I'm Harpreet Singh, welcoming you to the Future of Work Pioneers podcast. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Carl Benedict Frey, who is the director of the program on the future of work at Oxford Martin School at University of Oxford. Dr. Frey is an economic historian who was trained at Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition. He has served as an advisor to the G20, the OECD, the European Union, Commission, and the United Nations. In 2013, he co-authored a groundbreaking paper entitled The Future of Employment: How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization. His most recent book, The Technology Trap, was selected a Financial Times Best Books of the Year in 2019. Carl, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
So this 2013 paper that I mentioned, it was quite groundbreaking. And you came to the conclusion that 47% of American jobs would be impacted by automation. Some people have taken this to mean that these jobs would simply disappear in a couple of decades. You have said that you didn't suggest this at all. So what was the intent there?
So what had happened in the early part of the decade was that the potential scope of automation had expanded quite rapidly, and economic models that were looking at automation at the time basically said that automation can be done if something is routine, if something is repetitive, then you can specify it in computer code, and therefore it is quite easy to automate it. But what we were seeing in 2011, 2012 were loads of examples of non-routine tasks being done by computers. So if you think about translation work, medical diagnostics, some breakthroughs in autonomous vehicles, all of these things were things that economists would deem to be non-routine, yet we were seeing them increasingly, those type of tasks being taken over by computers. So what we asked at the time, in this new age of machine learning, where machines can essentially infer the rules of the games themselves by looking at the data trails we leave behind and learn through trial and error, and essentially the way we learn as humans, and what is the potential scope of automation in this new era of machine learning. And in that 2013 paper, we identified three key bottlenecks to automation, where we noticed that machines still perform very poorly. So one of them was complex social interactions. And we actually had some pushback on that a year later, because these Turing test competitions that we spoke about in the paper, we noted that no chatbot had done very well in these Turing test competitions, where chatbots tried to convince human judges of them being a person. And a year later, actually, one chatbot managed to convince 30% of human judges of being a person, but it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old Russian orphan boy speaking English as a second language with no understanding of English culture. And if you think about the variety of much more complex in-person interactions that we do, or many of us do in our daily jobs, it's important to remember this is just basic text communication, right? It's almost inconceivable that machines will outperform us in those domains unless there's a very radical breakthrough in machine learning, but we don't go that far in the papers trying to predict those. We deem them to be unpredictable. The second bottleneck to automation that we outline in the paper has to do with creativity, and there also we've received some pushback actually, but I think the key sort of intuition holds, and I think whether you think that creativity can be automated or not, to a large extent also depends on your definition of creativity. So it's absolutely clear that machines can generate novelty, and if you listen to pieces that have been written by computer software, the way that those algorithms essentially work is that if you take, for example, a database of symphonies, and you make, like Mozart, you label those symphonies as being the good ones, and then there are other ones you find not so good. And unsurprisingly, if you let the software work its magic, you will come up with something that sounds very much like Mozart, or essentially a recombination of those symphonies. But you're not going to arrive at Schoenberg, Arvo Pärt, or Stravinsky by doing that. And needless to say, people that are creative draw upon impressions and experience in all walks of life, not just pre-existing works. And it's hard to pin down what creativity really is, which means that because we even struggle to find it, it's actually very define it. It's actually very hard to teach machines. So we deem that to be another key bottleneck to automation. And the third bottleneck had to do with the perception and the manipulation of irregular objects and the navigation of complex environments. So we noted at the time that the average home has hundreds of objects. There is no general purpose robots that can manipulate and identify all those objects. If there's a piece of paper on the floor, you will instantaneously know if it's an important document or a piece of rubbish, or maybe even you won't know that. Sometimes it's actually hard to know exactly what's what. But for a machine, it's even even harder, right? And again, because we even struggle to do that, it's actually very hard to teach. And we have tremendously sort of dexterous hands. We're good at perception and manipulation tasks. Robots are nowhere near to that. So based on these sort of three key bottlenecks to automation, we tried to figure out how intensive actually jobs are in tasks that correspond to these engineering bottlenecks to automation. What we found in the study is that roughly 47% of jobs, which we deem at high risk, as you mentioned, are not very intensive in such tasks. And this is everything from, transportation logistics, so truck drivers' jobs we deem being at high risk of automation, cashiers, receptionists, people working in call centers, and so on and so forth. And one thing that we did notice in the paper as well, though, is that we're actually looking at, in this study, only at the potential scope of automation. So we have a section on limitations where we sort of clearly outline that these are not predictions. The potential scope of automation will depend on a variety of other factors. So when Nissan produces cars in Japan, for example, it relies heavily on robots. When it does the same thing in India, it relies more on cheap labor. So the cost of capital, or the relative cost between capital and labor, matters for automation. Even if Google Translate was to become perfect tomorrow, for certain documents to be valid, you still need them to be certified by a translator, which means that essentially even then, those jobs are not going to be automated unless we certify, for example, Google Translate. So legislation is going to play a role, and there's a host of factors that are going to play a role. And as I outlined in the book, you mentioned the technology trap. Worker assistance is another one that's featured prominently in history. So the pace of automation is a separate question.
So now, 7 years later, when you look at that 47% number, that that 47% jobs are susceptible to automation. So is the number now, in your view, higher or lower? Where do you end up now?
So I think it hasn't moved, and I should say, it's not like we think that the number is exactly 47%, right? It's an estimate, so it's sort of that sort of ballpark. I think in the domains that I just mentioned, I don't think we have seen that much progress since then. We've seen some incremental steps, but I think we actually also seen a tendency in the field of machine learning to focus on one particular branch, which is deep learning, which is getting most of the funding these days, and has gotten the best performance in the past couple of years. But I think one of the strengths of machine learning, actually, when we wrote this paper, was that we were living in this period of the anarchy of methods, if you like, right? So there were different tribes competing, and now it seems that everything is very centered on deep learning, which is hugely data intensive. And that is also its greatest drawback. And one parallel that I draw in the book, for example, if you go back to the first industrial revolution, and you will find that a number of inventors contributed to the steam engine. And Thomas Newcomen actually invented his steam engine long before James Watt invented the separate condenser. But still, James Watt is the person we associate with the separate condenser because it made it energy efficient. So before then, it required vast amounts of coal to power a steam engine. And in the same way, today, AI is extremely data inefficient. So I think we're really going to need this separate condenser moment in artificial intelligence for it to become to have a sort of more of an impact on the economy more broadly. And in some ways, I'm actually, because of what I just mentioned, the overwhelming focus on deep learning, today I'm actually less optimistic to some extent about where artificial intelligence is today, although there's clearly been progress, than I was back in 2013 when we published the paper.
Mm-hmm. The latest book of yours, The Technology Trap, Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation. So what is the technology trap? Can you rehearse some of the arguments of the book?
Yeah, so the question I try to answer in the book is, should we feel reassured if the future of automation mirrors the past? So, as you may have noted, the debate surrounding automation has very much turned into this dichotomy where either you believe that 47% of all the jobs are going to be automated, and half of the population is going to struggle to find work as a consequence of that, and there will be widespread unemployment. Or you tend to take the view that, well, we had 2 centuries of automation, we've only gotten richer of those 2 centuries, so we should embrace automation. And I subscribe more to the embrace automation view, but I think that people that make that argument also tend to have a rather poor take often on history. Because first of all, there's not been one history of automation. There have been very different episodes that turned out differently for working people. So during the first industrial revolution, for example, we saw this hollowing out of middle-income jobs as the mechanized factory replaced the artisan shop. We saw the labor share of income fall, and we saw economic polarization translate into political polarization and widespread social unrest. And what I argue in the book is that we are now sort of living through a fairly similar episode. The technology is obviously very different, but its impact on the labor market and the economy is quite similar in the sense that we're seeing this hollowing out of middle-income jobs, this time jobs in factories. We're seeing similarly declining share of income going to labor. And we are also seeing that economic polarization is translating into political polarization. And we see that populists are actually gaining political clout in places actually which have been most affected by automation. And the key point of the book is that there's nothing inevitable about technological progress. If that was somehow inevitable, the first industrial revolution would have happened a bit earlier in the history of humanity. If it was somehow inevitable, every country in the world would have adopted the same technologies that are in principle available to anyone, and would have adopted these technologies to the same extent, and every country would be rich as a consequence. But we know that that is not the case. And part of the reason, as I point out in the book, has to do with resistance to automation. So before the first industrial revolution, resistance to automation was the historical norm rather than the exception. We saw that not just in Britain with the Luddite riots, but that was something that was widespread across continental Europe and in Asia, India, and China as well. So this was clearly the historical norm rather than the exception. And I think we should, looking forward, acknowledge the fact that if certain people lose out to technological progress, even if it's not just in the short run, the short run can be a long time. During the first industrial revolution, it was 7 decades. If we look at the wages of prime-aged American men with no more than a high school degree, today their wages have been falling for 3 consecutive decades now. They've been made worse off in the labor market in absolute terms, as their earnings capacity has been diminished by globalization and automation, I should say. And they may potentially have incentives to opt against that change. And we're actually already seeing a survey evidence suggesting that the majority of Americans now favor limitations on the number of machines businesses can should be able to introduce to increase productivity. And we see also instances with workers going on strikes over the introduction of autonomous trucks, for example. So the key point of the book is that the world for a long time was in this sort of technological trap in which people resisted technological progress, and therefore we didn't see its long-term benefits over the fears of its short-run costs, and we are at risk at experiencing the same pattern again.
So you mentioned, obviously, we witnessed these riots during the first industrial revolution. They swept across Europe, and now we are seeing a similar kind of sentiment in society. But you also mentioned populism, this rise of populism amongst those who are the most marginalized by these new technological innovations and loss of jobs, loss of work. So what are the key differences that you see in these two periods?
Right, so that's a very important question. So clearly the political economy is very different, right? So during the first industrial revolution, most people didn't have political voice, right? So property ownership remained a requirement for voting. And as a result of that, the Luddites were essentially politically disenfranchised, right? And they rioted against the mechanized factory as a result. They didn't have any mechanisms otherwise apart from petitions. So they did petition to Parliament on numerous occasions as well, to asking them to ban the introduction of various types of labor-saving technologies. But those petitions were, by and large, always ignored. And as a result, they didn't have many other means, right? Today, average people in the industrial West can show up at the ballot box, and they are also doing so, fortunately. But what we do see is that in places that have suffered the most from deindustrialization, because of both globalization and because of automation, those places are much more likely to see voters opt for populist candidates. So, for example, if you want to explain why 3 key swing states in the United States, like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, who had opted for the Democratic candidate in every presidential election since 1992, all of a sudden ended up being won by President Trump, then robots is one of the prime reasons. So there are more robots in Michigan alone, for example, than in the entire American West. And most exposure to Chinese import competition, you actually see under the Rust Belt. So China hit America under the belt, as I think David also author has remarked on a couple of occasions. So you can actually disentangle the impact of Chinese import competition, which also had an effect from automation, which we find is even more important. And we've already seen this backlash against globalization. We haven't seen the same backlash yet against automation, must be said. But we've seen a backlash against globalization, which has had very similar effects on labor markets. And it's important to remember that the rise of China has already happened. It's not going to happen a second time. Most people today work in non-traded sectors of the economy, so they're relatively shielded from future globalization, but they're not shielded from automation. So the job of a truck driver, for example, is not going to be offshore to China. The job of a cashier is not going to be offshore to China. The same goes for the jobs of receptionists. But those jobs are very likely to be automated. So what I argue in the book is that going forward, automation is more likely to become the target that globalization recently has, because people are going to notice eventually that, yes, we hiked up tariffs now, these jobs are not coming back despite that. And the reason for that is automation.
Yeah. And so you mentioned something very interesting, that the Trump campaign leveraged this this anxiety that you cite a Pew Research poll that 58% of Americans have this anxiety about automation, and 85% think that automation should be restricted in some ways. So, but you mentioned Michigan. Michigan's seen automation for a long time, with these car manufacturers. And what else are you seeing, or did you see in Michigan?
So, I mean, so you're absolutely right, first of all, that automation has predominantly been driven by robot adoption in a few industries. So it's mainly in automotive, it's mainly in electrical machinery, and it's mainly in chemicals, rubber, and so on. So those are the industries that have been most affected, and the places that host those type of industries. Those are also the places where the communities have been most affected. And I think what's important to remember is when one factory job disappears, that also affects other jobs in the local service economy. So each manufacturing job on average supports 1.6 other local non-traded service jobs. And this is research by Enrico Moretti. So this means that as these communities deindustrialize, the local service sector is also taking a hit. And that means that the entire community suffers as a consequence of this.
This episode is brought to you by Experfy. Incubated in Harvard Innovation Lab, Experfy provides custom future of work solutions, such as private talent clouds and skill taxonomies. Experfy differentiates itself by using subject matter experts to pre-vet and pipeline candidates for AI and high-end technology skills. However, Experfy Talent Cloud Platform is skill agnostic and can be licensed to build custom talent clouds for any and all skills. In a different use case, enterprises interested in employee intermobility can license the Experfy platform to create an internal gigs marketplace where interested employees can be algorithmically matched to projects, gamifying their learning experience. Visit www.experfy.com for more information.
You're making a distinction here between jobs that are lost to globalization and jobs that are lost to automation. But what we're seeing this dual phenomena at work in a place like Michigan, because some of those factories, the car factories, are moving to Mexico, right? And that's globalization. Whereas, automation we already discussed. So I think the two things are happening simultaneously.
Oh, absolutely. And clearly also, I mean, you mentioned why now. So you also had, since the 1950s, you have these right to work laws in the United States, which has also meant that a lot of industry in the Rust Belt actually moved south, where labor unions were essentially not allowed to organize. So we see in this tendency, this sort of gradual deindustrialization, if you like, since the 1950s. But that is mainly if you look at manufacturing jobs as a share of total employment. So the declining manufacturing share is driven by the service sector growing more rapidly. If you look at the manufacturing sector in absolute numbers, it reaches its peak in 1979. So it's only from 1979 onwards that you actually see the manufacturing sector losing jobs in absolute numbers. Meaning that people, increasingly need to find work elsewhere. So I think that is the sort of key difference.
So, have you? So, what are some of the solutions? I mean, some people mention a robot tax of some sort, to help those who are marginalized. Your thoughts on solutions?
Sure. So I think there's this tendency to think that we have one big challenge and we need one big idea to solve it. So we need a robot tax to finance a universal basic income, and that will solve everything. But I think that's actually a misread of the situation for several reasons. So the first thing is we don't want to tax automation in particular, because automation is what has driven the increases in average incomes that we've seen over the past 200 years. So without productivity growth, wages can't grow. It's a prerequisite for long-run improvement in living standards. It's not the full story. So we've seen wages decoupling from productivity, which is concerning, but we've also seen a slowdown actually in productivity growth, and we can come back to that if you want, which is also concerning. So we don't want to tax robots as slow. We rather tax things that are unproductive, like potentially real estate, so financial transactions, or carbon emissions and other things. So things that we want less of, we want to tax. Secondly, UBI is unlikely to be the solution because, first of all, if you introduce UBI to replace the existing welfare state, it will probably worsen inequality, right? Because welfare transfers, as they are, target people at the lower end of the income distribution. The UBI is universal, it's received by everybody. So what you're doing then is you're effectively redistributing income from the lower end of the income distribution to the middle and the top. And I don't think that is going to make people at the lower end better off. Secondly, the key problem is not just vanishing incomes. So we should acknowledge that a lot of things have become a lot cheaper as a result of automation as well. Most people are consumers as well as producers. And in their capacity as consumers, people have benefited enormously, both from automation and globalization. But people also derive a lot of meaning from their jobs, from their work. And that is something that has been shown in a variety of surveys. People who work are happier than those who don't, across countries, across different periods of time, and so on and so forth. So I think what this comes down to is actually, yes, using the tax system to help people at the lower end of the income distribution, potentially trying to narrow the gap between capital and labor in terms of taxation. So what we've seen in most OECD countries is that corporate tax rates have been going down. Labor taxes on labor have essentially been flat or increasing. That essentially, incentivizes companies to invest more in labor-saving technology rather than labor-augmenting technology. And we could potentially use the tax system to try and fix that. Well, otherwise, it's a question of helping people adjust and incentivizing people to potentially move to where new jobs are emerging. So the way that people have adjusted to technology shocks in the past is by acquiring new skills and also moving to where new and better paid jobs are. And one key feature of the American labor market over the past 30 years or so is also that people are moving less, particularly across state borders. So I think what we need to do is try to reduce barriers to moving between jobs. So that has to do with occupational licenses on one hand. It has to do with non-compete clauses, which prevents people from moving in certain states. One of the strengths of California and Silicon Valley has actually been that non-competes are essentially banned there. So people can actually move between businesses, and without that, engineers would not have left Fairchild Semiconductor to found Intel and so on, right? So a lot of new business creation is actually driven by people moving out of existing establishments as well. Beside that, I think what we need to do is to reduce barriers to moving between locations or incentivize people to move. So one thing I advocate in the book is for the introduction of relocation vouchers, for example, because moving from a place where there are not so many jobs and many people are unemployed to a place where there's an abundance of jobs can be seen as an investment, which requires liquidity up front. So a case can be made actually to subsidize that relocation. And finally, I argue for more investment in infrastructure and housing to help people move into where new jobs are. So one example, for example, is which is close to my heart. It's in southern Sweden, where I grew up. Malmö was a city that had specialized in building ships for a long time. The shipyard closed down in the 1990s. The city fared quite poorly for a long time as it tried to adjust. Along came the bridge to Copenhagen, which meant that people who lived in Malmö all of a sudden could apply for jobs in a booming labor market in Copenhagen. And most people could stay put in Malmö still and live there, where housing was still cheap. And most people would spend most of their earnings in the local service economy where they lived, which also revived the local economy in Malmö. So I think connecting, expanding, and declining areas, I think a lot can be achieved. And finally, we need to build more in the places where these jobs are being created, because particularly low-skilled people struggle to move into where the new jobs are emerging, because real estate prices are just so high. So I think it's a package of things that can be done, not one solution.
So, these are interesting solutions that would certainly become prevalent in Europe, but to see like even a universal basic income, these kind of vouchers to move, right? This is the political realities in the U.S. that are going to prevent them from happening here. Any thoughts on whether these are really applicable to the U.S. context?
Well, I think they are particularly applicable to the US context, because many of these things already actually exist in Europe. So I think it's always important to remember when we talk about policy that every country is obviously different, right? So in Sweden, for example, 86% of the working population belongs to union or is under collective bargaining agreements, I should say. In the United States, I think it's something like 11%, right? So obviously, income differences differ a lot across countries also, because technology also interacts with existing institutions. But I think in the US context, I think there is broad agreement that the economy needs to become more dynamic. We've seen a sort of decline in new business formation for 3 decades. Productivity growth is slow, people not moving. These are things that wouldn't just, it's not just a transfer. It's actually something that also has the potential to make the economy more competitive, more innovative, more dynamic. And I think in the light of the sort of growing geopolitical competition with China as well, I think there is growing appetite for that sort of reform. So I'm actually, in that particular domain, I'm actually reasonably optimistic.
Mm-hmm. So you have argued that US is shielded from future globalization. However, it's not shielded from Amazon Go or autonomous cars. So what is the key point you're trying to make here? Why you think the US is shielded from globalization?
So I'm not saying that the US shielded from globalization. That's obviously not true. What I'm saying is that the labor market, most people work in non-traded sectors of the economy, and as a consequence of that, they are less exposed to, for example, Chinese imports. So the rise of China has already happened. It's not going to happen a second time. And that's the key point. And many non-traded jobs can be automated. So many jobs that are not exposed to imports from any other country can be automated away, but they're not, at risk of being offshored or replaced by foreign imports.
So are you seeing that the pandemic is sort of forcing companies to rethink their supply chains, that they want to bring back what's in China? For example, you're already seeing companies like Apple take steps to mitigate some of the delays in supply chain.
Yes, I think we're going to see clearly some of that. I think both Europe and the United States now, there's an overwhelming feeling that economies have become too dependent on China, and the reaction is going to be, to some extent, reshoring or nearshoring. And it's going to probably be a combination of the two. And as I mentioned earlier, right, when Nissan produces cars in Japan, it relies heavily on robots. When it does the same thing in India, it relies more on cheap labor. And that means, in its essence, as production is moving back to places where wages are higher, and that is going to also increase incentives to automate. It's going to increase the level of automation in the global economy. So I doubt that we're going to see a lot of jobs moving back, but we're going to see more production moving back.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to new jobs being created, what are the categories of jobs that you see that today don't exist that would come into existence?
Well, I'm an economist, so I'm not sure if I'm well equipped to predict the jobs of the future. I think if you had gone back in time and asked my great grandmother, what do you think the jobs of the future are going to be, she'd probably not say that. I think my granddaughter is going to be a software engineer, and my grandson is going to be a yoga instructor. She would probably not have had the slightest idea that those jobs will exist. And I don't know exactly what the jobs of the future are going to be, but I think they broadly fall into two categories. They're either very skilled jobs in tech industries, so they can be, big data architects, or Android developers, or very sort of tech-related jobs, doing things in nanotechnology and so on. And there are also a lot of in-person type of service jobs, like the ones of yoga instructors and so on, that where we actually sort of value the in-person interaction and experience. So I think most jobs are going to fall into one of those categories going forward.
Obviously, the high-tech industry is obviously an important one, but do you see other industries benefiting from automation, or all of them?
Yes, according to our estimate, automation is something that is to be expected in transportation, in logistics, in sales, in services, in construction, in administration, in production still. So, I mean, there's no field that is really unaffected by this. And we also see it in skilled sectors, and increasingly, so in finance, for example, algorithmic trading has been on the rise for some time now. We see that certain tasks done by doctors, like medical diagnostics, is increasingly something that's being automated. We see that document review in law firms is no longer part of billable hours. So these are things that are already happening. I think fewer jobs are replaceable in relatively skilled industries. Certain tasks may be automated. I may be relieved from more types of statistical analysis in my job. At some point I may be replaced with a hologram in the classroom as well, or maybe a more skilled professor giving a talk from somewhere else on the screen. So my job is also exposed to actually globalization. But overall, I think skilled jobs are less exposed to these technologies.
Now, switching gears, as an economic historian, how do you see this pandemic being different than what's happened in the past, like the Spanish flu, or the Great Depression, even in the U.S.?
Well, there's nothing like it really. I mean, there's no episode I can think of where we sort of consciously decided to shut down economies and people are not going out spending or not going to work because of concerns over the virus. So obviously, the 1918 pandemic is somewhat hard to disentangle from the First World War, and it was obviously something new, hugely disruptive, much more deadly than the pandemic we are living through now. But clearly, the way we responded to this pandemic and the way we've decided to sort of demobilize as a consequence of this, I think is truly unprecedented. And I can't think of a good sort of historical parallel to that. On the other hand, we have created recession or arguably even a depression out of this. And something that we tend to see during economic downturns is that businesses try to cut costs. So during during the Great Recession, you see that a lot of these routine rule-based jobs that can be easily automated disappeared and never came back. So businesses did automate more rapidly as a consequence of the crisis. And we also see that increasingly cash-strapped consumers tend to opt for cheaper goods and services. So when people go to McDonald's rather than a restaurant, for example, they are increasing the level of automation in the economy. And I think that automation is quite likely to be accelerated by this pandemic for those reasons. And in addition to that, we have the reshoring tendency that we discussed earlier, and we also have robots being used for social distancing purposes. Robots at hospitals being used to deliver food and medicine. FedEx is experimenting with robots that can now climb stairs and do deliveries, and even in high-rise buildings. So we are increasingly seeing automation to be used for all of these reasons. And I suspect that many of the ongoing trends that we've been discussing are likely to be exacerbated by this pandemic.
And what has been your assessment of the role that various central banks are playing at this time, pumping in money into various markets? The U.S. equity market doesn't seem to even think that there is anything wrong that's happening outside on Main Street, right? So how do you think about that issue?
I don't think about it too much, to be honest with you, but clearly, I mean, the action taken by central banks was a lot more swift than it was during the Great Recession. Clearly, if you think about the average restaurant having, cash for 16 days of closure, at some point, either they will have to reopen very quickly or they will have to lend to be able to bridge the gap until the reopening. So they're going to have to depend on credit. So the credit lines provided by the central banks have been absolutely critical in that regard. No doubt about it. So I think the coordination of the global response, the fact that central banks acted very swiftly, clearly contributed to making this a lot less worse than it could have been. But we're not out of this pandemic yet, and I think that's important to keep in mind. And I'm probably going to look rather silly or sound rather silly to people listening to this a couple of months down the road if I start to try to make predictions about how this is going to turn out over the next or unfold over the next couple of months.
Fair enough. So any parting words for our audience?
Well, I think overall it's important to remember automation is something good. Technological change, innovation, we want more of it, not less. But it comes with what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. That is painful and to some extent involved painful transition. And therefore we developed a welfare state to actually make sure that people who didn't adjust well didn't fall too far. And I think looking forward, it's important to remember those two lessons, that technological change is something good. It comes with creative destruction, which is painful, but we need to deal with the side effects that it brings.
Right. Thank you for an engaging discussion.
Thanks for having me.